This is the rough time notes. This is about slavery and the territories. In this, we're going to start with the jump off. And this is the Mexican-American War. Now, as Americans rolled out to the west, Texas became a prime place to be. And if you want to know more about Texas, there you go. Now, to develop and defend the province, Mexico offers cheap land grants to people coming out to Texas. And the Americans say, "What's up?" And so it was, "What's up, colonist?" So led by Stephen Austin, immigrants began to settle in Mexico. And they were American immigrants. And if you want to know more about Stephen Austin, there you go. Now, in the 1830s, tension between settlers and Mexico got turned up when Mexico banned slavery in 1829. The Americans that were there in Mexico were from the South, so guess what their opinion was? When the ruthless General Santa Anna comes to power in Mexico, settlers became concerned because they want to be their own. They want their own autonomy, they want to be their own government, and they don't want no part of no Santa Anna. And if you want to know more about Santa Anna, there you go. In 1835, Texas rebels against Mexican rule. They declare independence and adopt a new constitution. So now it is the country of Texas. So to crush the rebellion, Santa Anna leads a force against the Alamo, and he decimates everyone in it, including Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. So he decimates everybody in it, including Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett. And if you want to know more about the Alamo, there you go. There you go again. One more time with some James Bowie and some Davy Crockett. Now, Santa Anna expected the Alamo to scare the colonists to heck, but it became a rallying cry for a Texas win at the Battle of San Jacinto. And they actually capture Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. It was, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo. And if you want to know more about the Battle of San Jacinto, look over here. Now, Texas, when they win the Battle of San Jacinto, they force Santa Anna to give up more than the traditional boundaries of Texas and the boundaries that Texas had had for years. Mexico, even though Santa Anna was captured, refused to recognize this treaty, and it starts a border war with Texas and Mexico. Texas elects Sam Houston as the first president of Texas. Houston promptly negotiates with the United States for annexation. So now Texas is going to become part of the United States. He wanted this because he knew that being part of the United States, they're all United States immigrants, and so being part of the United States was a good thing. Well, not all, but most. And if you want to know more about Sam Houston, there you go. There you go again. Now, annexation takes time as the Van Buren administration opposed it, and future administrations supported annexation before Congress did. So annexation took time. The Van Buren administration opposed it, and administrations after him supported it, but Congress didn't. Now, James K. Polk was elected in 1844, and he had a promise. He was elected on the promise to obtain both Texas and Oregon. Congress agrees to annex Texas with the promise of gaining the entire Oregon territory from the British. He actually only gains some of the Oregon territory, which makes a lot of Congress not very happy with good old James K. Polk. And if you want to know more about James K. Polk, there you go. Now, Polk endorsed the Texas Treaty that was signed with Santa Anna, which angered Mexico and inflamed a border war. Congress was not in favor of this war and not in favor of starting a war. So Polk says, you know what? Let's get some Americans shot at. So he sends troops into the contested areas of Mexico in an effort to get the Mexicans to actually attack. Because if they shoot at American troops, Congress will say, hey, it's wartime, dude. Of course, the Mexicans do shoot at American troops in May of 1846, and Congress declares war on Mexico. Now, the U.S. held all the advantages in wealth, manufacturing, population, military training, so the war was very one-sided. They were the bad mamma jammas in this war. And if you want to know more about the American War, there you go. There you go again. Now, Americans were led by Zach Taylor and Winfield Scott, and it included several Civil War heroes, such as their subordinates like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses Grant, William Sherman, and, of course, Stonewall Jackson, and there were some others. And if you want to know more about good old Zach Taylor, there you go. And a little Winfield Scott for you, too. Now, the U.S. won every major battle in the Mexican-American War. They seized parts of New Mexico, California, Monterey, Veracruz, and they even won a battle in Mexico City. Now, the treaty that ends the war gives the United States Texas to the Rio Grande, California, and New Mexico. So the treaty that ends the war gives basically most of the southern part of the United States. Now, of course, they had won battles in Mexico City, so Polk thought the U.S. should get more. But he knew that Congress would not take a long war. And so he says, no mas, so he says, no mas, this is it, we are done. So the next part is bad time, and this is all about slavery and abolitionists. Now, in the early 1800s, slavery expanded with cotton production. The cotton gin was invented, it sped up cotton production, but you gotta have somebody to actually pick the cotton. Now, slaves were treated harshly, but a lot of them maintained their hope and dignity, and many slaves did what they could to fight back. Slave resistance took the form of sabotage, breaking of tools, outwitting overseers, and escape. Many slaves actually escaped through the Underground Railroad. And now the Underground Railroad wasn't a railroad. It was a system of houses where slaves could hide and move in between the night. And if you want to know more about the Underground Railroad, there you go. And there you go again. Now, some slaves actually fought back, such as Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831. He killed more than 60 in an effort to take an armory. And if you want to know more about Nat Turner, there you go. And again. Now, by the early 1800s, there were a growing number of Americans that were beginning to speak out against slavery, like Frederick Douglass. So by the early 1800s, the abolitionist movement starts really speeding up. By 1831, William Lloyd Garrison became the first publisher to publish an abolitionist newspaper, and it was called The Liberator. So William Lloyd Garrison, he publishes some words. And if you want to know more about William Lloyd Garrison, of course, wait for it. There you go. Now, in cities across the Northeast and the Midwest, abolition societies sprang up, and you actually see abolition clubs spring up, like in Pennsylvania. And if you want to know more about the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, it's over here. Now, Angela and Sarah Grimke, they were daughters of Southern slaveholders who saw slavery as immoral, and they wrote against it. So they were abolitionists. They were actually daughters of a Southern slave owner who wrote against slavery. If you want to know more about the Grimke sisters, whoop, whoop, whoop. And of course, the abolitionists, a lot of you already know, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who depicted the harsh life of slavery. So he could actually tell about the harsh life of slavery and became well known because of how eloquently he did that. And if you want to know more about Frederick Douglass, there you go. And there you go again. Now, in 1819, and this is where things are really going to jump off. In 1819, Missouri's admission to the Union causes a crisis in the country. Congress came up with a short-term solution. They would admit Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Basically, it's a kick the can down the road strategy from Congress, and that's going to be an issue coming up. If you want to know more about the Missouri Compromise, there you go. And there you go again. Now, the Wilmot Proviso proposed that all states gained in the Mexican-American War would be free. Of course, this is going to piss the South off, who thought slavery was essential to their economy, that they could not live economically without slavery. So the law passed the North-dominated House, but it fails in the Senate. And if you want more about the Wilmot Proviso, there you go. Now, in the election of 1848, both sides began wanting popular sovereignty, which basically was going to let the territories decide whether they're going to be free or slave. So kicking the can away from Congress, not even further down the road. And if you want to know more about popular sovereignty, there you go. So soon other territories began applying for statehood. So the question comes up again, and part of the problem was the numbers of people in Congress. They did not want it to be unequal on either side. And talk of secession began to come if agitation of slavery continued. So the Senate used the Compromise of 1850 to continue to push off the slavery issue. It included admitting California as a free state. It allowed slavery in Washington, D.C. without the trading of slaves. But the one that's really going to make a lot of people mad is it imposes stricter fugitive slave laws, which meant you had to, by law, return fugitive slaves. And there's the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 enraged many Northerners because it included the Fugitive Slave Act, which required its citizens to catch and return runaway slaves. So by law, you had to return a runaway slave. Northern states are also offended by what they thought was an increasing intervention in the affairs of states. Northern states passed personal liberty laws, which nullified many of the fugitive slave laws. Harriet Tubman helped slaves escape through a network of houses and hiding places called the Underground Railroad. So she was one of the main leaders behind the Underground Railroad. And if you want to know more about Harriet Tubman, there you go. There you go. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which condemns slavery by telling about the lives of slaves. And if you want to know more about Harriet Beecher Stowe, there you go. If you want to know more about Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's the Spark Notes for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, in 1854, slavery came to the forefront once again with the Nebraska Territory and the Ostend Manifesto. Now, the Ostend Manifesto was a proposed plan to purchase Cuba from Spain in order to create a slave state. Obviously, this was going to be an issue in Congress. If Spain refused, the U.S. would declare war. It obviously never passes because of the lots of opposition towards it. And if you want to read more about the Ostend Manifesto, it's over there. Now, to appease the South, Congress agrees to split Nebraska into actually two territories. They create Kansas, and they left the slave-free decision in Kansas up to popular sovereignty. So there was Nebraska and Kansas decided the slavery question through popular sovereignty. So, of course, both slavery and anti-slavery settlers moved into Kansas, with the Ostend Manifesto becoming the rallying cry for the anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. So now you're basically going to have a civil war. On May 21st, 1856, slavery forces raid, pillage, and burn an anti-slavery town. So, of course, the crazy man, John Brown, carries out midnight executions of pro-slavery settlers in retaliation. And throughout 1856, violent outbreaks occurred all over Kansas. Over the next several years, the question of how to admit Kansas baffled leaders, and it sparks violence. It even spills over into the Senate, when Brooks of South Carolina beat Sumner of Massachusetts over the head with a cane because he was delivering an anti-slavery speech on the Senate floor. And if you want to know more about Bleeding Kansas, there you go. And there you go again. Now, in 1857, you have another thing that sets people up. A slave named Dred Scott sued for his freedom when he was taken into a free state. The Supreme Court actually ruled that slaves are property. Therefore, with them being property, much like whatever else other property you want to call it, they cannot sue in court. And the government cannot deprive a person of property without the due process of law. So the big thing here is they named slaves property. And if you want to know more about the Dred Scott decision, there you go. So in 1858, Lincoln's profile began to raise with a series of high-profile debates between him and Stephen Douglas. Before this, he was just a one-term congressman, so nobody really knew who he was. Lincoln's focus was on stopping the spread of slavery into new territories, not on removing it from the existing. Lincoln was not on ending slavery from the existing territories. Mostly he wanted to stop the spread because he thought it would choke slavery out and eventually it would die anyway. And if you want to know more about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, there you go. And there you go again. Now, in the fall of 1859, A man named John Brown believed violence is the best way to end slavery. So in order to accomplish his mission, he led a raid on a federal arsenal. And this was actually put down by Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, both future Confederate commanders.